So we have just talked about social dilemmas that are rooted in interactions between two people. Two people who have the choice of whether to be more altruistic and cooperative or more selfish and exploitative towards each other. But this is not the entire universe of possible social dilemmas. In fact, many social dilemmas have to do with groups of people, maybe even entire societies of people. So a classic example of this kind of group-level social dilemma is something called the tragedy of the commons. And this is a concept that was proposed by an ecologist, Garrett Hardin, who was studying sheep herders in New England. And what Hardin noticed is that when sheep herders grazed their sheep on purely private land that only they owned, they often showed a lot of restraint and forethought. They didn't let the flocks get larger than the population size that pasture could support. Because if they let this flock get too large, the sheep would graze down the grass until it couldn't grow back. And of course, that's not helpful for anyone, right? Because then the pasture can't support any sheep. So they would show a lot of restraint. And Hardin noticed that this restraint and forethought would often break down when sheep herders were grazing on collective land, land that was shared by a lot of different sheep herders. In this case, they would let their flocks get bigger and bigger until the population size was not sustainable, the pastures would get grazed down, and then they actually wouldn't support anyone's sheep. And so this term has become generalized to refer to any situation where self-interest means that we share a resource in ways that are actually really not good for anybody. So with these sheep herders, if you're grazing on collective land, you have this opportunity to add one more sheep to your flock. And the benefits of that go only to you. You maybe get, $100 extra that year. And the costs of that are shared amongst everybody. So the quality of the environment goes down by just a little eensy bit because you added that one sheep. So your self-interest temporarily outweighs the kind of collective loss. And so you're tempted to do that thing that's ultimately not sustainable. And we see this not just in terms of sheep herding, but in lots of environmentally consequential behavior. In terms of how we manage our fisheries and oceans, in terms of how we manage our forests, right? You see people engaging in individual short-sighted action where they take too much from the collective resource because they get a lot of temporary benefit, even though the collective loss may actually be really substantial. So this is one example of a broader class of social dilemma that we call the replenishing resource management dilemma. We're going to contrast this with a really different kind of group-level social dilemma, which is what we call a public goods dilemma. And this is the situation where lots of members of a group need to contribute to a common resource. This is something like having a tax on everyone who lives in a particular community, and that tax supporting libraries, hospitals, schools, roads, etc. The problem here is that once you have enough funds to build a library, build a school, build roads, almost anybody can use them, whether they originally contributed or not. So you have the temptation to be what we would call a free rider, meaning somebody who somehow finds your way out of contributing, like if you cheat on your taxes, but benefits from the public services nonetheless. So let's really break down the distinction between these two types of dilemmas. For the replenishing resource dilemma, there is the temptation to take too much from a common resource in a way that leads that resource to decline or even collapse over time. With the public goods dilemma, there is the temptation to not do your part and contribute to a resource that benefits everyone. Now, why do people engage in the replenishing resource dilemma? Well, it's because they can often eke out a little bit of extra benefit before they experience the costs of that over-harvesting. And why are people tempted to engage in free riding? Well, this is because sometimes you can get the benefit of the resource without shouldering the cost of actually contributing to it. And the societal risk for the replenishing resource dilemma is that you end up with this risk of the resource collapsing. The risk with the public goods dilemma is that if too many people try to free ride, too many people cheat on their taxes, too many people don't contribute to charity, etc., if no one contributes, you end up not having that public good at all, or having the quality of that public good be lower and lower, like with an underfunded public school. All right, so is there any optimism in this situation? I've just presented to you this picture of human nature where there's all these temptations to be selfish, these temptations to rat out our buddies, temptations to take too much of a resource, temptations to not contribute to a public resource. Can we do anything to make people act in a more cooperative way? Well, the answer is, of course, yes. And it relies on the power of social norms, both descriptive social norms and injunctive social norms. It turns out that if you frame a social dilemma in a way that makes it seem like the normal thing to do and the correct thing to do to be cooperative, people are often cooperative. This is demonstrated in something that I'm going to call the community game study. What these researchers did is they went to a bunch of dorms at Stanford. They actually got in contact with RAs in these dorms, and they asked them to identify residents that they thought would be really likely to cooperate. So the really sweet, caring people they thought would be really likely to defect, so the kind of jerky, selfish people. And then the researchers actually went and recruited the likely cooperators and the likely defectors. So that's like the person level variable, right? They took the person, people who are on two opposite sides of the spectrum, and then they also changed the situation. They took the cooperators and the defectors, and they randomly assigned them to play a version of the prisoner's dilemma game, but called it the Wall Street game or the community game. And in both cases, they had exactly the same incentives. They could choose to cooperate, which would be a choice that would generally give their partner better outcomes, or they could choose to defect, which would generally give them better outcomes, and with the outcome that if they both cooperated, they'd do better than if they both defected. Standard prisoner dilemma game. And this is what they found. It really didn't matter whether you are someone that the RA had nominated as being a jerk or a really nice person. In both cases, you were much more likely to choose to cooperate if the game had been called the community game. A simple change in title, even without a change in incentives, made people much nicer in how they played the game. In fact, so much nicer that people were twice as likely to cooperate in a community game versus a Wall Street game. So in sum, social dilemmas, these are situations where you have an incentive to be selfish. But if lots of people choose the selfish alternative, everybody ends up worse off. So in one-on-one situations, we use the paradigm of the prisoner's dilemma. With large groups, think about things like public goods dilemma, replenishing resource dilemma, an example of which is the tragedy of the commons. Now, there are multiple motives that can be involved in non-cooperation. These include being greedy and trying to exploit the other people. It could also be fear. You could not cooperate to try to be protective of yourself. And it turns out that if we frame situations as intrinsically cooperative, if we make it seem like the normal and correct thing to do to be cooperative, people actually fall in line with that, and they make much less selfish decisions. So with that, this is our final video for the week. See you folks in class.